All right, AP Euro folks, I haven't made a new video in a long time, and I had to look at the old videos, and I thought, why don't we have a video based on the review guide at the end of the chapter one, the one that looks kind of like this. Yours probably doesn't look like that because that's what mine looks like after I've scratched it up. And here's where I am. I have had a look at the test, the multiple choice portion of the test, the essay portion of the test, and I've sat down, kind of scribbled down my notes, and I'm going to share those thoughts with you over the next 15 minutes. So hopefully that's worth your time. I really do think it should be worth your time. Hopefully you think so too. Let's go. We start up here in the right-hand corner with the absolute of the absolutists, Louis XIV, King of France, Bourbon, king for a whopping 72 years. Louis builds this enormous palace at Versailles, and Versailles is meant to be a sign of the prosperity and also of the greatness of Louis XIV. It's a place where all of his nobles are gathered together and a place where he is going to force them into ridiculously foolish chores as a way of belittling them. Louis's policy on how to handle the nobles tends to be take away all of their power. Meanwhile, send out people to the provinces, create a huge bureaucracy, get a big army going, 400,000 men, and that way you're the only individual in the society who has any kind of power at all. Now, on top of that, Louis in 1685 is going to issue the Edict of Fontainebleau. And in doing so, he is going to revoke the Edict of Nantes, which was issued in 1598 by his predecessor, Henry IV. The Edict of Fontainebleau makes it illegal for anyone in France to practice any religion other than Louis, that is Roman Catholicism. Why do that? Well, it makes sure that there is one king, one God, one faith, one organized French society. Louis stands as a model to other absolutists around Europe who might think, how do I go about being this powerful myself? Well, it's a pretty good setup. Eliminate any chances of authority that can challenge you, like your nobles who you bring closer to you in this case and belittle. Gather together a massive army, 400,000 men, use it as you choose. Eliminate any kind of religious minority, and suddenly you've got a well-organized state. Now, here's the downside. Louis doesn't have enough money for all of this. Louis's finance minister, Colbert, is stretched to the limits to try and tariff and to bolster the economy and to build roads and to try and explore French colonies. And when push comes to shove, there just isn't enough money for the French to be able to make this affordable. So one of Louis's biggest problems is always going to be, I can't afford this. Now, Louis is not going to say that himself, but France itself is going to be pushed to the limits of bankruptcy as Louis is the king. In the last section here, it says goals in the War of the Spanish Succession. Without getting too far into the weeds, the War of the Spanish Succession is a typical war of this period in that it's about balance of power. It's not about religion. It's not about Protestants and Catholics. It's about Louis trying to expand the dynasty and the state of the Bourbon and France. Louis wants to hand down to Louis XV a larger France. He wants to extend it to what he would consider to be its natural borders, and that means trying to take as much space as possible. And don't forget that Louis is at war for 57 of his 72 years. He's constantly fighting, trying to make sure that the state is bigger. Now, Louis doesn't manage to take Spain and combine it with France, but he does manage to put one of his grandsons, a different Bourbon than the one who will become Louis XV, on the throne. So it's a loss, but it's still somewhat of a victory for Louis. This other little box here in the bottom left asks us to kind of pick either or, and I'm going to cheat and just look dead at it while I do it. Incidences of the plague are going to go down. Wars are going to become less bloody. Both of those are going to mean that the population is going to go up. That's the European trend after 1750, population up. The Grand Tour was most common among wealthy young men. Neoclassical art was reminiscent of the art of the Renaissance. Elite women had more children on average in this period because, frankly, they can afford to. Society tended to be more tolerant of religious difference in the period, particularly at the upper levels. Maybe not at the lower levels, but that's something you're going to see a lot of among the elites. Moving on to Tsar Peter the Great of Russia. The Romanov ruler of Russia, Peter the Great, is obsessed with one word, and that's the word you have to remember for him, and it's westernization. He's going to build a new capital at St. Petersburg. He's going to put together an army like Louis, 200,000 men strong. He's going to try and pursue as much learning, as much Western styles. He's going to require his nobles to come live with him in St. Petersburg. He's going to give them the best jobs in the army. He's frankly going to do everything that he can do to try and look like a Western ruler because, frankly, Russia has a perception problem. And that perception is that they're backward, that they're Asiatic, that they're Eastern. And what Peter has to do is try and overcome that in as many ways as possible. That means spending money, building a bureaucracy, organizing the society, and it's very difficult to do, right? It's one thing to say, well, I'm King Louis XIV of France and I organize all the French people. It's a relatively small plot of land compared to the Russian state, which is a whopper when it comes to things. So it's very difficult for anyone to gather that many people on one page. Peter the Great's going to be the first of the Romanovs to try and do it. Unfortunately, many of his efforts are going to die with him. Flipping over the page. Other Eastern European leaders, just a few notes here. Frederick William, the Great Elector of the Hohenzollern clan, is going to do everything he can do to be an absolutist. Now, that means a deal with his nobility. The deal is this: you let me be the absolute ruler of Prussia, and I will, in exchange, let you, nobles, be free from taxation, completely control your peasants, and have the best jobs in the army. It's a bargain that allows the Hohenzollerns to build this massive Prussian state really around an army. That becomes the biggest part of this bureaucracy. The Hohenzollerns are not that much concerned with other ideas or things within a bureaucracy. They just need an army for an aggressive foreign policy when necessary. Like, for instance, when Frederick the Great invades Silesia at the beginning of the War of the Austrian Succession. That's a great Prussian moment. Try and find your opponent at their weakest, steal some land, and refuse to give it back. The Prussians had a smaller state, but they had a more trained army than the Austrians, and they understood that they had an advantage there. That triggers a couple of big wars. We'll talk about them down the road here later on in this video, but it's a good sign of how the Prussians do business. They use that army. They don't use it that often, but when they do, you're in trouble. All right, over on the other side of this box, we've got Emperor Leopold of Austria. The key word for Austria is polyglot. They're a polyglot. They're a mix of people, and today we say that's the strength of the United States, and that's what it is, but not for the Austrians. The Austrians are an ethnic, religious, linguistic, I said religious twice there, mess. They are a variety of different people living under one house, and unfortunately that makes it very difficult for Leopold or for any of the Habsburgs rulers of Austria to make the place their own. So therefore you're going to get a very light form of absolutism there. There's a mention here of Joseph II. Joseph II, one of the later Habsburgs, who, while the leader of Austria, tries to make the place just about as hip as possible. All the Enlightenment ideas are kicked down the road. He passes thousands of laws and decrees, and unfortunately for him, this just isn't the right country. You know, if he was the leader of France or England or a place that had some experience with Western ideas, with a little bit of reform, maybe the Netherlands even, but Austria? No, man. You are Austria. You are too backwoods for these things. And so his radical ideas cause a society to really sputter to an end. And unfortunately, that epitaph that Joseph writes, "Here lies Joseph II, who failed at everything he undertook," is so poorly true. Now, it's kind of like my shirt, "You're killing me, Smalls." He wrote that to himself. He said, "Joseph, you're killing me, Smalls." Maybe he didn't, but hey, I'm having fun. All right, constitutional monarchy. England. The other idea, instead of having an absolute monarchy, is perhaps to have a limited monarchy, a monarchy where there's a parliament holding the monarch back. Now, the Stuarts have already had one go-round with the parliament. In the 1640s, Charles I lost his head at the hands of Cromwell and the Roundheads. In 1660, the Parliament calls the Stuarts back, and during the reigns of Charles II and his brother James II, things are kind of dicey and not very good, but it's a king, and we're happy to have a king back. Until 1688, that is. In 1688, James II, who's getting on in years, has a young male child, who is not supposed to happen, and there he is. Now, why do we say it that way? Because up until now, we thought that the throne would pass from James to his oldest daughter, Mary, who's a Protestant, or his second oldest daughter, Anne, who's a Protestant, or to one of the cousins who are Protestants. But it doesn't. It passes, in this sense then, to what would be Charles III, the next Catholic king of England. The Parliament, not wanting that to happen, reach out to Mary, oldest daughter of James, and her husband William of the Netherlands, and offer them a bargain. You can be the rulers of Britain, but you must follow a Bill of Rights. Then that Bill of Rights will restrict you. You can't dismiss the Parliament. You can't have an army during a time of peace. You can't restrict the powers of the press or the freedom of speech. You can't crack down on the society in that way. There have to be regular meetings buildings of Parliament. You have to be an Anglican. In other words, you can't be a Catholic. So the English have really limited the power of a monarch here. This is a constitutional monarchy, a system where you still have a monarch. In this case, the Stuarts are still holding on to power, but they are checked by a strong parliament. It's something we don't see going on anywhere else. It's not happening in France. It's not happening in Prussia or in Austria or in Russia, but it certainly makes the English stronger and more adept as a result of it. How do these ideas inspire John Locke? Well, John Locke's kind of the godfather of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment has the idea that society is based off of natural liberties and rights that are not necessarily based in religion. Up until now, we've made a big deal of how religion is the governing idea of a society. That's not true according to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment goal is to try and find the way in which human beings function. What is it that's common to us all? Now, John Locke would say what's common to us all is that we all have natural liberties that can only be given up by us to a government as long as the government continues to monitor those and to protect them. If a government stops doing that, then human beings not only have a right to rebel, they have a responsibility to rebel. Because if you don't trust that government, then it is no longer the government that has your consent, and you need to rid yourself of it. That's what happened with the Parliament and the Stuarts in 1688 in Britain. Now, other things that we see with the Enlightenment, I'm just going to fall down to the slide just below it over here on the right. We also observe guys like Voltaire talking about the idea of tolerance. Now, Voltaire is well ahead of his time, and the College Board loves both of these guys, both Locke and Voltaire. Locke really tied to any question about natural liberties, the rights of people, something that challenges the traditional views of government. Locke's a good common answer there. And Voltaire, especially if I'm talking about a challenge to religion. So if I want an answer that Voltaire is going to show up for, something about how the Catholic Church is bad, organized religion is bad, and also, let's go fancy words, kind of Eurocentrism is bad. Voltaire is one of the first good thinkers in Europe who looks abroad to the rest of the planet and goes, I don't know how likely it is that God only intended for us to be right about everything, that our religious ideas are the best, that we're the only good people on the planet. Isn't it possible that people living in other places have good ideas? In fact, maybe great ideas, maybe even the right ideas? And as a result of that, we start seeing from Voltaire a real worldly idea. Much of this is powered by the scientific revolution, the age of exploration, that we're beginning to understand that this is a much more global place than we ever thought it was. And as a result of that, Voltaire comes off as a real modern worldly fellow. We talked about Montesquieu. Whenever you see Montesquieu, you want to think checks and balances or separation of power. We talked about Adam Smith. I want to give Smith some time here. Smith's ideas of capitalism put into the hands of the individual, not the government, the real power of the economy. It's the individual who makes each of the decisions that makes a government or an economy function. I don't have to be taught how to make a good bargain. I don't need the government to tariff a good or to tax a good or to control the economy in order for the right decisions to be made. I simply need to have my brain, a price that I see, and a commitment as to whether or not I think that's the right price. This laissez-faire or hands-off mentality is the heart of Smith's capitalist argument. Smith would say that as a society, we need to allow people to simply function as they wish. Now, raw capitalism then might bring with it some really ugly stuff like child labor. That's another discussion for a different day. But Smith's ideas here deeply challenge anything that might be mercantilist. We talked about Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his ideas of how to raise children by experience. Let me hit this last slide over here. Lower class diets were generally based around veggies. In the War of the Austrian Succession, Austria allied with Britain, and then remember that switches because, number 3, in the 7 Years' War, Austria allies with France. That's the end of a lot of hostilities, but really, it's a balance of power move again. Who were we fearful of in that last war? Prussia. And as a result of it, the other big powers, Austria, France, and Russia, get together to try and limit Prussia. And the 7 Years' War, Prussia allied with Britain. It's Britain who's going to try and poach all of France's New World or North American colonies, and they do. People in the period produced more food per acre, and the government in Poland allowed the the nobility more power. It's the nobles who really run the show there. I'm right on 15 minutes here. I hope this was a worthwhile use of your time. Study, folks. I promise you it's going to pay off. Thank you.